I never believed in Bigfoot until I came face to face with it. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, and I still wake up in a cold sweat when I think about it. My name doesn't matter, but what does matter is that I'm a ranger with 15 years of experience working with wildlife. I've dealt with bears, mountain lions, wolves, and every dangerous animal you can think of. Nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in those woods. It all started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late September. The leaves had just started to change color, and I was looking forward to a quiet season before winter set in. My supervisor called around 7 a.m., which was unusual since he normally didn't show up at the office until 9. His voice sounded different, strained in a way I had never heard before. He told me they needed me for a special assignment, a top-secret job that would pay triple my normal salary. Triple? That should have been my first red flag, but I was desperate for money. My truck had broken down the week before, and the repair bill had eaten into my savings. My daughter was starting college the following year, and every extra dollar counted. The supervisor didn't give me any details over the phone, only told me to meet at the ranger station at 6 a.m. the next day. When I pressed for more information, he stayed silent for a long moment before saying it was a dangerous animal situation that required experienced personnel. He stressed that caution was absolutely critical and that I couldn't discuss the assignment with anyone, not even my wife. That night, I barely slept. Something about the whole conversation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. I kept telling myself, maybe it was just a problem bear, or a mountain lion that had been attacking livestock or threatening hikers. Maybe the landowner was someone important, and they wanted to keep the situation quiet. I arrived at the ranger station just before 6 and saw a black pickup truck waiting in the lot. 3 other guys were already in the bed of the truck, and I could see their breath in the cool morning air. I recognized 2 of them as rangers from neighboring counties. Both were tough, seasoned men I'd worked with before. The third man I didn't know, but he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors. We all climbed into the truck bed with little conversation. Everyone seemed tense, which reinforced my assumption that we were dealing with a serious wildlife situation. The 2 rangers I knew gave me a nod, but no one was in the mood to talk. We settled our gear and braced ourselves for what looked to be a long ride. The truck pulled out of the lot and headed toward the mountains along roads I'd driven countless times. But after about 20 minutes, we turned onto a Forest Service road I'd never been down before. The road was rough, barely more than 2 ruts through the trees, and we bounced around in the truck bed as the driver steered around rocks and fallen branches. About 40 minutes into the ride, one of the men sitting in the front passenger seat turned to look at us. He was wearing a business suit, which looked completely out of place for where we were supposedly going. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes polished, and his hair styled like he was headed to a board meeting, not into the wilderness to deal with a dangerous animal. But what struck me most was his expression. He looked terrified. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of the seat. His eyes were wide, haunted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He stared at each of us in turn for a long moment before clearing his throat. His voice shook when he finally spoke, nothing like the confident tone you'd expect from a man in an expensive suit. He told us we were all being paid more money than any of us had ever been offered for a single job. In return, we had to remain silent about everything we saw out there. Everything. The situation was classified, and if word got out, there would be serious consequences. He didn't say what those consequences were, but the fear in his voice made it clear he wasn't bluffing. The way he delivered the message wasn't exactly threatening, but there was something in his eyes, a desperate kind of fear that suggested he was as scared of the situation as he expected us to be. We all glanced at each other, but no one spoke. The silence in the truck bed grew heavy, uncomfortable. I found myself studying the man in the suit as we continued driving. He kept checking his watch and glancing nervously back at the forest behind us, as if he expected something to be chasing the truck. His hands never stopped trembling, and he kept wiping sweat from his forehead even though the morning air was cold enough that the rest of us were wearing jackets. After another hour of rough driving, we finally stopped at what could barely be called a clearing. It looked like someone had cut down just enough trees to park a vehicle. The forest pressed in from all sides, dark, dense, and menacing even in the morning light. The man in the suit got out of the truck and walked around to the back, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive and completely out of place. He set the case on the tailgate and pulled out a detailed topographic map, the kind the military uses. The map showed terrain features I didn't recognize, even though I thought I knew this part of the forest pretty well. He pointed to a spot deep in the wilderness where we were to set up camp, maybe 8 or 10 miles in. Then he indicated another area about 2 miles from camp where we were supposed to set traps. His finger shook as he traced the route we were to take. The creature we were hunting was big and aggressive, he said. It had attacked several hikers in recent months, though he didn't give details about those attacks. We were to stop it, preferably alive if possible, but lethal force was authorized if necessary. He stressed that the creature was extremely dangerous and that we should not underestimate it, no matter how much experience we had with wildlife. As we began unloading gear from the truck, my blood ran cold. These weren't standard animal traps. They were bear traps, but massive, far larger than anything I'd seen in 15 years of wildlife management. Each one was easily 3 feet across, with steel jaws that looked like they could snap a telephone pole in half. The teeth were razor sharp and nearly 6 inches long. One of the other rangers let out a low whistle as he hefted one of the traps. The thing had to weigh at least 100 pounds, maybe more. The chains attached to each trap were just as intimidating, heavy steel links that looked more like they belonged on a ship's anchor than on animal traps. "What exactly are we hunting?" one of the other rangers asked. He was staring at the massive traps with the same sinking feeling I had in my gut. These things were built to catch something huge, something far bigger than any bear I'd ever come across. The man in the suit hesitated for a long moment, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "The animal hasn't been identified," he said finally. "It's extremely large, definitely dangerous, and it's been terrorizing hikers for weeks. That's all we need to know." He avoided our eyes as he said it, staring down at the map instead. He didn't say bear, but that's what we all assumed. Maybe some kind of mutated grizzly or an unusually large specimen, but those traps suggested something even bigger than the largest bear ever recorded. The more I looked at them, the more uneasy I felt. We slung our heavy packs over our shoulders and began the hike toward the designated campsite. Each of us carried around 60 pounds of gear plus one of those enormous traps. The hike was going to be brutal under normal circumstances, but something about this forest made it 10 times harder. From the moment we left the rough road and entered the trees, the woods felt wrong, too quiet. In 15 years working in the wild, I had never experienced silence like this. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no insects buzzing around our heads. Even our footsteps sounded muffled, like the forest itself was swallowing the sound. The trees here grew closer together than in other areas I'd worked, creating a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. Everything was cast in a dim, twilight haze that made judging distances difficult. The air was heavy and suffocating, like breathing soup. About half a mile into the hike, we started to find the first signs that something was very wrong in these woods. It all began with camping gear scattered across the ground, a torn backpack dangling from a tree branch about 8 feet off the forest floor, and shredded pieces of sleeping bags lying in disarray. The damage looked deliberate, nothing like the kind of mess you'd expect from a bear rummaging through someone's campsite. Then we found the blood-dark, dried patches smeared high on tree trunks, some 8 or 9 feet off the ground. It had soaked deep into the bark, looking as though it had been there for weeks. Whatever left those stains was either incredibly tall or had hurled something bloody with immense force. One of the rangers knelt to examine a piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch. The material was thick, the kind used in heavy jackets or outdoor gear. But the way it was ripped didn't suggest claws, it suggested raw strength. The tears were straight and clean, as if something had simply torn the cloth apart with its bare hands. From that point on, the mood shifted. The casual chatter from earlier died out completely. Every one of us kept scanning the tree line, gripping our rifles tighter than necessary. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of branches sounded like approaching footsteps. The deeper we went, the more evidence of violence we uncovered: shredded clothing, more blood, random fragments of camping gear. At one point, we came across the remains of a tent that had been completely obliterated. The fabric was shredded, the aluminum poles bent and twisted, and the stakes had been ripped out of the ground with such force that clumps of dirt still clung to them. But the most unsettling discovery wasn't the destruction, it was the smell. As we pressed deeper into the woods, an odor hung in the air that none of us could place. Musky, animal-like, but mixed with something else. It reminded me of wet fur and rotting flesh. The stench grew stronger with every step until it was so overpowering we had to breathe through our mouths. After nearly 2 hours of trekking through this grim scene, we stumbled upon something that froze us all in place. In a small clearing where the canopy broke enough to let sunlight through, we found tracks in the soft earth. At first, we crowded around, thinking we had finally discovered what we were dealing with, something we could identify, prepare for. The footprints were preserved perfectly in the mud near a shallow creek. But as soon as we looked closer, every face around me went pale. They were enormous, about 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at their broadest point. And yet they weren't paw prints, they weren't claw marks, they were footprints, human-like but impossibly large. The toes were clearly defined, the arch was visible, even the impression of a heel. But no human has feet that size, and no human weighs enough to leave imprints that deep in solid earth. We found dozens of tracks crisscrossing the clearing. Some were partially covered by fallen leaves and debris, suggesting they'd been made at different times, spanning days or even weeks. The stride between each print was massive, at least 4 feet, meaning whatever left them was either unimaginably tall or capable of taking monstrous steps. One of the rangers crouched down and placed his size 11 hiking boot next to one of the prints. His boot looked tiny in comparison. The depth of the print spoke of something impossibly heavy. It was far heavier than any bear I had ever tracked, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This makes no sense. No bear would leave prints like this. There's no animal I know that would leave prints like this. They look almost human, but no human could be that big or that heavy. We spent nearly 30 minutes examining the prints, trying to come up with any rational explanation for what we were seeing. But there was nothing. These were the footprints of something that shouldn't exist, something that didn't fit any animal classification we knew. That's when 2 of the 15 men with us made their decision. They dropped their packs right there in the clearing and began gathering their personal belongings. "I'm out of here," one of them declared. "Whatever this is, I didn't sign up for it. My wife's pregnant with our first kid, and I'm not dying out here for any amount of money." The other man nodded, hoisted his lighter pack onto his shoulders, and left all the government-issued gear behind. "Everyone else should come with us," he said, looking around. The feeling was wrong, everything about it felt wrong. These weren't animal tracks, and whatever made them couldn't be stopped with the equipment they had given us. They started back down the trail, and I'll admit part of me wanted to follow. My gut told me the same thing, that we were walking into something we couldn't handle or understand. But the pay was too good to ignore. I kept telling myself I'd handled dangerous situations before. We watched the 2 rangers vanish down the trail, and the forest seemed somehow quieter after they left. The 13 of us who remained stood around those unforgettable prints for a few more minutes. No one wanted to be the first to suggest we push deeper into whatever territory we were entering. Finally, the oldest and most experienced ranger among us hoisted his pack and adjusted the straps. "We're too far in already," he said. "At least, let's set up camp and see what we're dealing with. But everyone stay alert. From the start, the signs indicated this situation exceeded our capacity. We needed to get out." The rest of the hike to the campsite took another 2 hours, and it felt like walking through a graveyard. The silence persisted, broken only by our footsteps and distant sounds none of us could identify. Sometimes it sounded like branches snapping deep in the woods, but the cracks were too loud and too sharp to be dry limbs falling. Along the way we found more evidence. Branches broken at heights that would require enormous reach, strange gouges carved into bark, high and deliberate beyond any normal animal. At one point we found a boulder the size of a refrigerator moved from its original place, leaving deep furrows in the earth where something had dragged or rolled it several feet. The designated campsite sat in a small clearing ringed by dense forest on all sides, which made me deeply uneasy. There was too much cover for a huge creature to hide and watch us. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, with a little stream running along one edge. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an ideal spot to camp, but knowing something enormous and unknown prowled the surrounding woods made the open patch feel like a trap. We would be exposed from every direction, nowhere to run if something charged out of the trees. We set up the tents in a tight circle in the center of the clearing and built a stone fire pit by the stream. The sun was starting to set and the temperature dropped fast. None of us wanted to be setting up camp in the dark, especially not here. While we worked, I kept catching glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing, only dark tree trunks and shadow. But the sensation of being watched was so strong it gave me goosebumps. I wasn't the only one feeling it. I could see the other rangers constantly glancing toward the woods, their hands never far from their weapons. One of the guys suggested an early warning system. Empty cans threaded with stones and tied to fishing line, strung around the perimeter of our camp. It sounded like a good idea, so we spent the last hour of daylight rigging a makeshift alarm about 30 feet out from our tents. We used nearly 90 meters of fishing line to create a near-invisible web of trip lines connected to dozens of cans. If something large tried to approach the camp at night, it would almost certainly hit one of the lines and set off a cascade of clanging. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was better than nothing. We also staged the giant traps we had hauled in, though we hadn't set them yet. The plan was to deploy them in the morning at the spots the map had marked. Just looking at those traps made me sick to my stomach. What kind of creature required those kinds of traps? Spring-loaded steel jaws powerful enough to break an elephant's leg. The teeth were sharp enough to cut through bone, and the chains were anchored to steel stakes we'd driven deep into the ground with a sledgehammer. Everything about those traps said we were dealing with something unimaginably large and incredibly powerful. That night we sat around the fire trying to keep the conversation light, but everyone was on edge. We took turns telling stories about dangerous animal encounters we'd survived in the past, trying to convince ourselves this was just another job. Black bears that had grown too comfortable around campsites, mountain lions lying in wait for hikers, bull moose gone aggressive during rut, but even our darkest stories felt pale compared with what we'd already seen. None of us had ever faced an animal that left 18-inch human-like prints or had the strength to tear camping gear apart like tissue paper. As darkness fell, the woods around us remained eerily quiet. No owl calls, no rustling of nocturnal animals, no insects humming. It was as if everything in the forest had fled the area, leaving us alone with whatever had been responsible for the destruction we'd discovered. I was scheduled for the second watch, which meant I could try to sleep for a few hours before my turn to patrol, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me reach for my rifle. The fire cast dancing shadows that looked like moving figures, and every gust that shook the trees sounded like footsteps approaching through the woods. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep and lay awake in the tent listening to the sounds of the night. That was the first time I heard it. A low, distant rumble, a sound that seemed to come from deep in the forest. It wasn't exactly a growl, and it wasn't exactly a call, but it was clearly made by a very large living creature. The sound lasted about 10 seconds and raised the hair on my arms. Whatever made it was powerful enough that the noise must have carried for miles through the woods. I lay there hoping I'd imagined it. But about 20 minutes later I heard it again, this time coming from a different direction. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning, but my sleep was full of nightmares of giant shapes moving through the trees and eyes watching us from the darkness beyond the fire. Then, at 4:30 a.m., the alarm went berserk, not 1 or 2 cans, but what felt like the whole perimeter, a deafening clatter in the silent forest. Dozens of tin cans clanged and rattled as something struck our trip lines and tore across the fishing line. We all sprang up and grabbed our weapons, stumbling out of the tents half-dressed. The noise came from many directions at once, as if whatever was out there had completely surrounded us. The cans continued to clatter for nearly a minute before the commotion finally stopped. We raced to the edge of the camp with flashlights and rifles, sweeping the beams into the woods where the alarm had been triggered. The cans were still swinging violently. Some had been ripped clean off the lines and lay scattered on the ground, but we couldn't see anything beyond the tree line with our flashlights. The fishing line had been severed in dozens of places, not just snipped but torn as if by enormous force. A few of the cans had been hurled so hard they were embedded in tree trunks 20 feet from where they'd been hung. One of the rangers swore he'd heard footsteps during the chaos. The heavy, deliberate footsteps sounded almost human, but there was far more weight behind them. The footsteps circled our camp several times, he said, always just beyond the reach of the flashlight beams. We stood there in a defensive ring around the fire for the rest of the night, backs to the flames, trying to peer into the darkness beyond our light. Nobody even suggested trying to sleep again. Whatever was out there knew exactly where we were, and it had gotten close enough to touch our alarm system without any of us seeing it. The waiting was the worst. We knew something was watching us from inside the woods, but we couldn't see it or hear it move, like being studied by an invisible predator that could strike at any moment. At first light, we broke into pairs and prepared to go out and set the traps at the locations marked on the map. Nobody wanted to leave the relative safety of camp, but we had a job to do. We packed our heavy packs with those giant traps, extra ammunition, and emergency flares. The trap sites we'd been given were within a 2-mile radius of camp, placed along what appeared to be game trails marked on our topo map. When we reached the first site, we realized these were not normal trails. The path through the woods was clearly worn by repeated use, but it was far too wide for deer or elk. The trees on either side of the trail had been pushed back or broken, creating a corridor nearly 8 feet across. The ground was compacted from years of heavy foot traffic, and we found more of those enormous prints pressed deep into the soil. Whatever had been using these trails was huge and had been traveling them for a long time. Setting the first trap took nearly an hour. We had to dig a pit to conceal part of the steel jaw, then cover it with branches and leaves. The trap was so heavy, it took 3 of us to place it correctly, and driving the anchor stakes required swinging a 10-pound sledgehammer. While we worked, I kept getting the sensation we were being watched. Time after time, I would stop and scan the surrounding trees, but I could see nothing. The others had similar experiences, constantly glancing over their shoulders and jumping at the slightest sound. The second sight was even more disturbing. That trail passed between 2 large boulders, creating a natural choke point any animal walking the path would have to pass through. But someone or something had altered the area. Branches had been woven between the boulders to form partial camouflage, and we found what looked like crude markings carved into the stone faces. These markings were not random scratches. They appeared deliberate, resembling a primitive writing system. Some were simple geometric shapes, circles, triangles, parallel lines. Others were more complex, pictographic, like ancient cave paintings. They'd been cut deep into the rock with something sharp and powerful. We also found more impossible tracks. Some prints were so fresh they had to have been made during the night while we slept. The prints led straight to the boulders where we were working and vanished on the far side. Whatever made them had passed through that exact spot recently, perhaps watching us set the traps. The thought that this creature had been moving around our camp in the dark, close enough to trigger our alarms, yet smart enough to avoid detection, made my blood run cold. By early afternoon, we had set all 6 traps and returned to camp for a quiet meal we hoped would calm us. For the first time since entering the woods, things seemed normal. We warmed canned food over the fire and swapped family stories from back home. Sunlight filtered through the canopy. Birds finally began to sing. The oppressive atmosphere from the previous night seemed to lift. We started to think perhaps whatever had been stalking us had moved on to another area. That false sense of security lasted exactly 3 hours. A scream erupted from deep in the woods in the direction of the largest trap we'd set. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard in 15 years of working wildlife. Part roar, part human scream, angry and in pain. It echoed through the trees and seemed to stretch on forever, rising and falling in urgent waves like a siren. We grabbed rifles, first aid kits, and extra gear and ran toward the noise, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. The screaming continued as we ran, growing louder and more desperate the closer we got. Layered beneath the main scream were other sounds, clanking iron chains, the snap of branches, and something that sounded like steel being strained to the breaking point. What we found at the trap still haunts my nightmares. The trap had sprung perfectly. Something enormous was caught in that massive steel jaw, and it was truly ferocious. At first, through the trees and brush, it looked like a giant covered head to toe in dark brown fur. But as we closed the distance, the details became clearer, and I realized we were not looking at any animal I had ever seen before. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. Its shoulders were broader than any human's, easily 4 feet across, and its arms were disproportionately long. The hands were huge, with thick black nails that looked strong enough to rip bark from trees. But it was the face that really got my attention. It wasn't human, and it wasn't quite ape either. Heavy, prominent brow ridges, a jaw too large and too powerful, eyes set too far apart. Yet there was intelligence there, a kind of awareness you don't see in ordinary animals. When it saw us approaching, it emitted another bone-chilling scream and began wrenching at the trap with incredible strength. The steel jaw had clamped onto its left foot just above the ankle, and the creature was trying to pry it free with bare hands. The chain anchoring the trap to the steel stake was taut, and I could hear metal groaning under the strain. We all just stood there for a few seconds, too stunned to move or think clearly. This thing was not supposed to exist. It looked like something out of a prehistoric textbook, the missing link between humans and an ape long extinct. The creature seemed to notice our hesitation and, as if understanding we feared it, it stopped thrashing and focused its attention on us. It studied each of our faces with those calculating, intelligent eyes. Its gaze held hatred, but also a kind of recognition, like it understood exactly who we were and what we had done to it. At last, one of the rangers pulled out a tranquilizer rifle loaded with enough sedative to drop a full-grown grizzly. His hands shook as he raised the weapon and aimed at the creature's shoulder. The dot struck with a faint pop, and we all stepped back, waiting for the drug to take effect. Nothing happened. The creature glanced down at the dot protruding from its fur, plucked it out with 2 fingers, and tossed it back at us. If anything, it seemed even more agitated, thrashing against the trap with renewed fury. The ranger quickly reloaded and fired again, this time into the creature's chest, where the drug would absorb faster. We waited. Still nothing. The dose should have brought down a 1,000-pound bear, but it had no effect on this thing. He fired a 3rd dart, then a 4th. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the creature's movements grew sluggish and unsteady. Even then, it never fully lost consciousness. It only became too weak to keep fighting the trap, swaying on its feet and glaring at us with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. It took all 13 of us working together to haul the half-sedated creature onto the heavy cart we'd brought for transport. Even drugged, it had to weigh at least 600 pounds, maybe more. We wrapped heavy chains around its arms and legs. The chains were clearly designed for this very purpose, with locks and fittings that suggested someone knew exactly what we'd be up against. As we secured the creature for transport, I got my first close look at it. The leg caught in the trap wasn't broken, which seemed impossible given the strength of those steel jaws. Its bones had to be extraordinarily dense and strong to withstand that kind of pressure without snapping. The fur covering its body was coarse and thick, more like a boar's bristles than the soft hair of a primate. Beneath the fur, muscles bulged as if carved from stone. This thing was built for raw strength and endurance, designed by evolution to survive conditions that would kill an ordinary human. But the most unsettling part was how human its hands and feet appeared. Out of proportion, too large, too powerful, but unmistakably structured like ours. Fingers with the same joints in the same places. Opposable thumbs. Feet with the same arch and toe arrangement we had seen in its tracks. Back at camp, we assembled a massive cage from parts packed in our supply crates. Everything fit together perfectly with bolts and brackets, as though it had been custom designed with exact measurements in mind. The cage was large enough to contain a 9-foot creature, with steel bars thick enough to withstand its tremendous power. We placed the unconscious being inside and secured multiple heavy locks on the door. Even unconscious, it was an intimidating presence. In the confined space of the cage, it looked larger and more powerful, than it had in the forest. In daylight, at close range, I was struck by its ancient appearance. Its bone structure, its muscular development, even the patterns of its hair growth, everything about it suggested something that had evolved separately from modern humans for hundreds of thousands of years. We had to keep administering tranquilizers every few hours just to maintain control. Whenever it began to stir even partially, it would fix us with that burning gaze, full of hatred and uncanny intelligence, unsettling everyone present. This was no dumb animal that had stumbled into our trap. There was something thinking behind those eyes, something that knew it had been captured and was already planning. What would it do to us if it ever got free? The way it studied each of us was especially unnerving. It would focus on one person for several minutes, memorizing their face, then move on to the next, as if it were creating a list of enemies to remember for later. That night, we set up 2 men to stand watch in shifts, always keeping an eye on the cage while the others tried to get some sleep. I volunteered for the first shift with the most experienced ranger in our group. We sat about 10 feet from the cage with our rifles resting across our knees, close enough to monitor the creature but far enough to stay out of reach through the bars. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. The creature remained unconscious, breathing slow and steady. We kept our voices low and avoided any sudden movements that might wake it. Around 2 a.m., our improvised perimeter alarm went off again, but this time we could see what had triggered it. Shadows were moving between the trees just beyond the firelight. At least 3 or 4, maybe more. They stayed in the darkness, but every so often we caught a glimpse of massive shapes slipping stealthily through the forest. "There are more of them," my friend whispered, his voice barely audible. "There's a whole family of these things out there." The shapes in the forest seemed to be communicating with one another through low, rumbling sounds that we felt more than we heard. They were coordinating their movements, taking up positions around our camp as if planning a coordinated attack. We quietly woke the others as quickly as we could, and everyone armed themselves. But none of us dared to leave the firelight to investigate. Whatever was out there had the advantage of numbers, the cover of darkness, and knowledge of the terrain. That's when the rocks started. The first one whistled out of the darkness and crashed into our fire pit, scattering burning logs and sparks. What followed was a barrage stones hurled with shocking power and accuracy. Some were the size of baseballs, others as large as bowling balls. We scrambled for cover behind trees and gear, but the onslaught went on for nearly an hour. The creatures moved through the forest, always staying hidden, using the darkness to keep us pinned down and terrified. The most frightening part was their coordination. While some hurled rocks, others made noise from different directions, trying to confuse us into believing we were surrounded by dozens of them. We heard branches snapping in the distance as they shifted positions, always just beyond our sight. Each time we tried to rally or push back, another volley of rocks forced us back into defensive crouches. They kept us powerless for hours, proving themselves smarter and more organized than any animal we'd ever encountered. The psychological warfare was nearly as effective as the physical assault. The constant noise, the feeling of being surrounded, the knowledge that something intelligent and hostile was watching our every move. It steadily ate away at our nerves and our ability to think clearly. Around 4 a.m., the attack stopped as suddenly as it began. The forest grew quiet again, but we knew they were still out there, watching and waiting. We huddled close around the remnants of our fire, taking turns keeping guard, jumping at every snap of a twig. By dawn, we were all exhausted and utterly shaken. The oldest and most experienced ranger among us, the one who had been leading us since we entered the forest, called us together for a meeting. He looked older than he had just days before, as if the fear and strain had aged him years in a single night. His face was stern as he looked around at each of us, seeing the exhaustion and the horror etched into our eyes. "This was a mistake," he said quietly. "We don't belong out here. These things, whatever they are, they won't stop until their friend is returned. And there are more of them than us. They're smarter than we thought, better organized than we imagined, and they know this land far better than we ever could." He looked around at us again, his expression serious but not panicked. "I'm calling this expedition off," he declared. "Pack up, we're leaving." No one argued. Each of us had already come to the same conclusion during that long, terrifying night. This was beyond our training, beyond our equipment, beyond anything we were prepared to handle. We had been outmatched by creatures that shouldn't even exist, and staying any longer in their territory would only get us killed. As we tore down the camp and loaded our packs, I couldn't stop glancing at the cage with the unconscious creature inside. Part of me felt guilty about leaving it there, but a larger part of me was terrified of what might happen if we tried to move it and provoked another attack from the others. The creature was starting to stir as the sedatives wore off, and it was watching us pack with those calculating, intelligent eyes. It seemed to understand what was happening, and there was something almost satisfied in its expression, like it knew its family was coming to free it, and that we had finally shown enough sense to get out of their way. We withdrew in tight formation, eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The sounds of the others followed us for the first mile, branches snapping in the distance, the occasional low rumble that seemed to coordinate their movements, and the unmistakable thud of heavy footsteps pacing us through the trees. But they never showed themselves. Maybe they just wanted to make sure we were really leaving their territory, that we had no plans to come back. Or maybe they were too focused on rescuing their captured kin to bother with us anymore. Every step away from that camp felt like a small victory, but none of us dared to let our guard down. The forest around us remained eerily quiet except for the things shadowing us among the trees. We moved as quickly as we could while still holding formation. No one wanted to be the one who lagged behind and got separated. About halfway back to where we had started, new sounds drifted from behind us. The screech of metal tearing apart, the crash of heavy objects being hurled aside, and those same inhuman screams we'd heard the night our trap was sprung. It sounded like the creatures were dismantling our camp and breaking open the cage to free their family member. The noise carried on for nearly an hour as we kept our distance, never daring to turn back. No one suggested trying to retrieve the creature. We had learned our lesson about underestimating what we were dealing with. By the time we finally reached the rough dirt road where the truck had dropped us off, I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in days, but the truck wasn't there waiting. We had been told someone would be there when we were ready to leave, but the road was empty. We waited 3 long hours before another black SUV finally arrived. The same anxious man in the business suit sat in the passenger seat, but now he looked even more terrified than when we had first met him. His face was pale, and his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the radio he was using to speak to someone on the other end. The ride back to civilization passed in total silence. None of us wanted to talk about what we'd been through, and the man in the suit was far too busy keeping his urgent radio conversations to pay us any attention. I overheard pieces of what he was saying, something about a failure to contain, asset recovery, and initiation of secondary protocols. When we reached the ranger station where the whole nightmare had begun, we were separated and taken to different rooms for individual debriefs. I spent 6 hours in a windowless room with 2 identical men in gray suits asking me the same questions over and over. They wanted every detail about what we'd seen, what the creatures looked like, how many there were, what capabilities they displayed. They were particularly interested in the intelligence the creatures had shown. Coordinated attacks, tool use, how they communicated with one another. At the end of the debrief, they handed me a stack of documents to sign. Non-disclosure agreements, security clearances, statements affirming that everything I'd witnessed was classified at the highest government level. They made it very clear that discussing any aspect of what had happened would carry serious legal consequences and possibly criminal charges. But they didn't really have to threaten us. None of us wanted to speak about it anyway. Who would believe us? And more important, who would want to hear that creatures like that live in our country's forests? I was put on 2 weeks paid leave and told to report to a different district when I returned to work. The official mission record states I was on routine wildlife management duty during the period we were actually in that part of the woods. On paper, nothing unusual ever happened, but I knew better, and I could see from the other rangers' looks that word was already spreading through unofficial channels about what had truly occurred out there. There were rumors of similar encounters in other regions, stories of elite government teams handling classified situations, whispers about facilities where captured specimens were being studied. Within a month, I learned that the entire forest area where we'd been deployed had been quietly closed to the public. The official reason given was unstable ground making hiking dangerous, but anyone familiar with the area knew that was nonsense. Barricades went up, no trespassing signs appeared, and the whole region was declared off, limits to civilians. Through informal channels, I heard they'd brought in specialists, anthropologists, military personnel, people with equipment we'd never seen before. Whatever those creatures were, the government was intent on studying them and keeping their existence secret. I never learned what happened to the specimen we captured, though I have my suspicions. Part of me wants to believe they returned it to its family after any research they conducted. But given how intensely the government scientists seemed to be involved, I doubt it was that simple. 6 months later, I requested a transfer to a different district, somewhere as far away from that forest as possible. I told my supervisor it was for personal reasons. He didn't press for details, but I think he understood that some of us needed distance from what we'd encountered. Even now, 3 years on, I still can't fully process what happened in those woods. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, thinking I hear low, rumbling calls echoing through the dark, or I catch myself sweeping my eyes across tree lines searching for massive shapes that shouldn't exist. I've heard rumors from other rangers about similar encounters in a number of places across the country. Cover-ups, vanished evidence, witnesses quietly moved away or suddenly choosing early retirement. There's an informal network of people who've had experiences like mine, and sometimes we exchange information quietly off the record. Of course, the official line is that these creatures don't exist. Any reports of unusual sightings are chalked up to misidentified bears, hoaxes, or the psychological strain of working alone in the wild. But those of us who have seen them know better. What puzzles me most is recognizing how long this has probably been going on. These creatures are not a recent phenomenon. They have lived in our forests for who knows how long, remaining hidden and avoiding contact with humans. But as we push farther into remote areas and improve our surveillance technology, encounters have become more frequent. The government's response shows they have been dealing with this situation for years, even decades. Dedicated equipment, established protocols, a network of people who know how to handle these incidents. None of that could have been built overnight. This is a long-term operation that most people, even most government personnel, know nothing about. Still, then I think about the intelligence of those creatures and their obvious ability to remain hidden when they want to. Maybe the current arrangement is for the best. They remain deep in the wilderness where most people never go. We stay in our cities and developed areas, and everyone is safer for it. I thought about leaving wildlife service altogether and getting a job in a city as far from the backcountry as possible. But this is the only profession I've ever known. And, more importantly, someone needs to know what's actually out there. Someone needs to watch for signs that these creatures are expanding their territory or becoming more aggressive toward humans. That is what worries me most about the whole experience. The creatures we encountered were not merely defending territory. They were studying us, learning our capabilities and our weaknesses, learning how we operate. The coordinated attack on our camp demonstrated a level of tactical thinking that suggested they were capable of much more than simply hiding in the woods. What happens when coexistence is no longer viable? What happens when human expansion into remote regions reaches a tipping point and conflict becomes unavoidable? These creatures are strong enough to rip spring steel traps apart with their bare hands, smart enough to plan coordinated attacks, and apparently numerous enough to have family groups dispersed across different forests. The government clearly has contingency plans to deal with them, but I wonder if those plans are enough for a species that has successfully avoided detection for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. We captured one of them by luck and overwhelming force, but they freed it within hours and drove us from their territory entirely. The official reports from our deployment were heavily redacted and classified, but I know they were being used to develop new protocols for future encounters. There are people in government facilities somewhere studying every detail of our experience, trying to understand the creature's abilities and develop better methods for dealing with them. I hope they are also considering that the best approach might be to leave them alone. Our brief encounter proved these creatures are entirely capable of defending territory. Perhaps the wisest course is to establish clear borders and respect them. The forest where we met them remains closed to the public, and I know there are monitoring stations scattered through the area, motion sensors, cameras, listening devices, all designed to track movement and behavioral patterns. It's as if they've turned the whole region into a massive research installation. I wonder what they've learned from all that surveillance. Are the creatures still there, or have they retreated deeper into the wilderness to avoid human observation? Do they know they're being watched? And if they do, how do they adapt? Those are questions I will probably never have answers to. So we are left in this strange situation where a small number of government officials and researchers know about the existence of an unknown species while the rest of the world remains oblivious. It is a secret that grows heavier with time, especially when I see families camping in areas that may harbor these creatures. If you don't believe this story, that's fine. I hope you never have to find out for yourself whether I'm telling the truth. But if you ever find yourself deep in the wilderness and you get the feeling something is watching you, trust that instinct. If you hear sounds that don't match any known animal, take it seriously. If you find footprints that are far too large and too human-like, if the woods around you fall unreasonably silent, get out. Don't try to investigate. Don't try to photograph or gather evidence. Leave as quickly and quietly as you can. And don't look back, because once they know you've seen them, they will not forget, and they do not forgive. All I know is that these creatures are real. They are intelligent and they are out there. Anyone who ventures into their territory deserves to know what they may be stepping into. For now, they seem content to remain deep in the wild, away from people. But climate change, deforestation, and the steady expansion of human development into remote areas mean encounters will likely become more common. When they do, we will need people who understand what we are really facing.